Captain America Brave New World is upcoming, and with the return of MCU Sam Wilson, it reminds me not only how much of a fan I am of Anthony Mackie Sam Wilson, but also how the MCU is kinda responsible for a pretty big comic retcon with the character. At the start of the MCU, they didn't have the right to mutant characters. However, there was of course workarounds. The biggest known being Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, who in the MCU weren't introduced as mutants, but instead originally given powers created by the Soul Stone. Although WandaVision kinda undoes some of that and say that Wanda actually had her powers at birth, while Quicksilver's a bit of a question mark. Them no longer being mutants would result in the comic versions also being retconned as no longer being mutants, or even Magneto's children. They're not the only characters who were once mutants and later rewritten not to be because of Fox owning X-Men characters, although this retcon actually predates the MCU. However, it was still likely done to avoid the eventual issue it could bring. This being Sam Wilson, who was in fact said to be a mutant for decades in comics, however hardly ever mentioned outside of a couple instances, but he still very much was a mutant until it was all retconned away in the 2000s. Just out of nowhere, right after X-Men was bought by Fox. Well, not right after, a few years passed, but pretty close afterwards. When I refer to him as being a mutant, I don't mean his power to fly, as that's because of his fake wings which are tech-based, but his lesser known power of minor telepathy, something that's actually not a part of the MCU version of the character. Now, when the character was first introduced in Captain America issue 117 from 1969, he wasn't called a mutant. He was recruited by Captain America Steve Rogers to help face a Red Skull who had stolen his body by using the Cosmic Cube. Note all that, this is all going to be important later on. This story is actually a very petty showing a Red Skull. He switches bodies with Captain America to try to ruin his reputation, not by doing something like cancel level worthy or being a full-on villain as Captain America, but instead just being mean to people on the street, not properly tipping, not being polite, not saying excuse me after he burps. That's his way of ruining his reputation, not by full-on murdering innocent people that would make people absolutely hate Captain America forever, but by kind of just being a bit of a nuisance. Sam Wilson be given the title of Falcon by Captain America since Steve thought it was a cool sounding name. Sam's background has heavily changed over the decades, but at this point he was a social worker. The name Falcon is inspired by Sam's own pet falcon, Redwing, who Sam has a very special connection to. It's less pet and man and almost like they're friends, as if they know each other's thoughts. Because they do. They have a telepathic link that's at first had just been natural. Whatever that means. A lot of people didn't know what that meant, so after 5 years it was later explained. Also, side note, it's so weird saying the name Sam since that's my name and I feel like I'm talking in the third person. In Captain America and the Falcon issue 173 to 175 from 1974, during the era Falcon was co-leading the comic, we get an explanation during a story with the X-Men, the original X-Men. The plot is about Hydra kidnapping mutants. Captain America and Falcon are trapped in the base while the X-Men are trying to help, but they seem not to be able to find them. But at this point, Professor X has a specific tie to other mutants, and they find them because of Falcon's own telepathic powers, with Professor X being able to jump onto them like telepathic links. However, when Falcon asks if that means he's a mutant, Charles replies that doesn't necessarily mean he is one, but he might be, making it more unsure as if he is or not. This arc is actually where Nomad comes from, with the leader of this branch of Hydra being revealed to be an American government politician in power, which makes Steve no longer trust his country. I feel like he probably shouldn't trust his country really ever, considering all the crap they do in the Marvel Universe. And in the real world. Back to Falcon, we wouldn't get clear confirmation of him being a mutant until his 1983 miniseries, where he's outright called a mutant. This being the second issue, where we see him take on a sentinel that identifies him as being a telepathic mutant. This also seems to imply the possible chance that Sam might have more potential with his telepathy than just his link with Redwing, who he uses to take down the Sentinel by going into the robot and disabling it. Sam doesn't really have much of a reaction being called a mutant, which feels to imply he might have already known, or perhaps he just assumed from Professor X's statement beforehand that he was a mutant. The character afterwards would occasionally be referenced as being a mutant, however it could easily be missed since it was only mentioned maybe once every other year. It wasn't really a thing that came up all that often, not even when he became Snap Wilson. That is a story for another time. However, in the Avengers 2001 one-shot, it would be said that Falcon had actually got telepathic abilities from contact with the Cosmic Cube, all the way back in his first appearance in the 60s. Now, this was 7 years before the MCU started with Iron Man 2008, and 13 years before Sam Wilson's MCU debut in Winter Soldier. However, this was post-Fox owning X-Men movie rights, meaning it was likely a change to avoid eventual issues, or maybe other reasons, as technically it was never said why. But why else would you retcon something that I think was a pretty simple answer to Falcon's powers? Just that he was a mutant. You went out of your way to retcon it and make it a lot more complicated than it needed to be. And I'm not entirely sure why else you would do that unless it was a rights problem. Well, less a rights problem and more being petty about rights. It would also be said that the Sentinel apparently was damaged, and that is the reason why I was going after Sam Wilson, which feels like an over-the-top attempt to retcon this. In fact, later stories would double down on this retcon to ensure it was erased entirely. But doesn't really slot in well because the Sentinel was identifying him as Falcon, so the Sentinel knew who he was and still attacked him, so he must have not been that damaged. In the MCU, Sam Wilson doesn't actually have any powers, instead Red Wing is a robot droid. For now at least, I can see them giving him powers now that mutants are being introduced. If Ms. Marvel can be a mutant, so can Sam Wilson. If I'm being honest, I really do like the idea of Sam Wilson being a mutant. I think it makes the corners of Marvel feel more connected, and implies the possible potential in Sam Wilson's powers. Something that I'm not a huge fan they got rid of for the MCU. I really do like the MCU's version of Sam Wilson, but getting rid of his power set I think was a bit of a minus for the character. It could also be a very interesting story for him as Captain America. Captain America being a mutant in the universe could be a really interesting concept to see how people react in-universe. Considering how they react to the X-Men simply existing, imagine if Captain America in the universe was also a mutant. I think there's a lot that could be done there. However, I still like Sam Wilson regardless, being a fan of him either as a mutant Falcon or a human Captain America. I'm pretty sure the character is going to stay human for probably the rest of the character's long history going forward. However, I wouldn't be against the character becoming a mutant again, maybe even in the movies. Although, yet again, I think that's pretty unlikely. And that's it. Like always, please like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!